The 19th century French writer and poet Anatole France made a certain statement of the obvious that, in spite of how obvious it is, where's Anatole? There he is, okay. In spite of how obvious it is, it still rather needed to be said. The law, in its majestic equality, forbids the rich as well as the poor to sleep under bridges, to beg in the streets, and to steal bread. We talk about liberty and freedom as if these lofty aspects of a more perfect union are attained simply by abolishing slavery or insisting that our court system, no matter how skewed it really is somehow blind to race and class and allowing the public to choose their own profession and avocations. But that presumes that you have a choice. No sane person who owned a house would want to sleep under a bridge. Although camping looks a lot like that to me. I don't understand a lot of that. No decent person would steal bread if they could afford to buy it. No one's going to beg in the streets if they have resources. So the laws that prohibit sleeping in homeless encampments, panhandling at street intersections, or petty theft are not laws for those of us that have any resources, a living wage, or any other form of income. Now, I don't like panhandlers at intersections. I wouldn't like being robbed. I would be uncomfortable if a homeless family moved into my backyard. In our minds, though, under the influence of a fairly rigid Protestant work ethic, we tend to assume that everyone has an ability to sleep in a home of their own, or at least a rented apartment, that everyone could buy groceries if they just would, or other necessities. But it doesn't take much time to wake up to the fact that it just ain't so. But it seems to take quite a bit longer to figure out what to do to create this more perfect union enshrined in the American Constitution. Now, I've just returned from spending a few days touring the cradle of American democracy in Boston. None of our founders were quite as pure and selfless as they were presented to us as being in our early education. But in spite of how much spin was put on their real character, there really were a number of geniuses in their number who were attempting to create a democracy that was better than, that was more free than any government that had existed before. They weren't at all consistent with their lofty language that they put into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They compromised on the full humanity of people of color. They did not allow women to vote. And while that's probably the easiest thing for us to talk about, there were other laws governing women that make voting seem like a small issue. But the language of freedom and liberty was there, and they wrote a Bill of Rights that was intended to ensure the people of this country would have liberty against the kinds of abuses that they had suffered, not only under the hands of the British monarch, but quite frankly from their colonial governors. But as Franklin Roosevelt observed in the State of the Union address in 1944, of which you've just heard a portion, that people who are in desperate poverty are not really free. I think that should be obvious. But my good friend, Ron Hertenstein, and I have argued this point a number of times, and since he's not here, I will use him as a foil to present my case. Trust me, it's a lot easier to argue with Ron this way. You've heard me say through the years that virtually all of our bananas are harvested under slave conditions. Almost all of our coffee, even what's called fair trade coffee, is typically harvested under slave conditions. Most of our shoes and clothes, everything I'm wearing today was manufactured in South Korea, probably under slave circumstances. Now, Colonel Ron would insist that if those workers could freely walk off of the coffee plantation, the banana farm, or out of the sweatshop where they sew our suits and our shoes with Italian-sounding labels, that they're not slaves if they could walk off. Now, I've been to the coffee plantations in Nicaragua dozens of times, and I can speak with authority that most of the larger ones have armed guards at the streets, roads, who are holding machine guns in front of them, who look like they would shoot the workers if they tried to leave. But at least in theory, they could leave if they had anywhere to go. The land is owned by the very wealthy in huge tracts of land. The poor own nothing, and as far as they know, the whole world is made up of plantations owned by wealthy people who hire thugs that carry machine guns. So they could walk off, maybe. They could walk for 2 weeks, and they would just end up at another plantation where their circumstances might be even worse. I say that is slavery, or the equivalent thereof. Colonel Ron says that if they can leave, they're not really slaves. But guess what? Ron's not here. I've got the microphone. Looks like I just won that debate. I'm encouraged by the fact that I also have Franklin Roosevelt on my side. You may be aware that having Roosevelt on your side does not always close the deal, however. Many of his contemporaries called him a socialist, and there was actually a fairly serious plan to gather up disgruntled veterans and form a militia that would remove him from power. They don't talk about that in school, but you could review the basic facts in my sermon of June 18th, 2017, entitled War is a Racket. You can find that just by searching War is a Racket on YouTube. The more years that I preach and the bigger our catalog becomes, it gets more and more like a Sherlock Holmes series where you kind of have to know the backstory to know what's going on today. But a slave who's bound by chains and goes to work at the point of a sword, in our time, a virtual slave is bound by the chains of poverty and goes to work at abusive jobs that do not pay them a living wage because they do not have a better option. I argue that that's still slavery. We don't want to acknowledge that Walmart, McDonald's, Amazon.com, engage in slave labor practices, but if you have to work there and you don't have another choice, isn't that slavery? And as long as the largest employers set the salary for the rest of the economy, our experiment in democracy envisioned by Washington and Jefferson and Franklin and Adams stays on very thin ice. Crushing poverty threatens to turn democracies into tyrannies. And if you don't see how our democracy is rapidly becoming a tyranny, truly you're not paying enough attention to the news. I don't want to waste 1 minute of my precious time talking about our 45th president this morning. It is just a basic fact, though, that any president, any government administration in Congress or the Senate that widens the income gap, that undermines the wages and benefits of the poor, is in effect dismantling democracy and setting up a tyranny. Say that again. Thank you. The promised middle-class tax cut actually went into the pockets of the 1% with this tired old trickle-down propaganda saying that giving money back to corporations would cause them to create more jobs. That isn't what makes corporations create jobs. Demand, purchasing demand for services, that's what creates jobs. You just give them money with no more demand, what happens is they engage in stock buybacks. So the tax cut, in effect, was borrowing money from China that creates stock buybacks, which elevates the stock market. So it looks, the stock market's going up, but all the resources from that go to offshore bank accounts, all of which hastens the collapse of both our economy and our democracy. I'm not an expert on American history, but I know enough to recognize that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, Ben Franklin, all had glaring blind spots, moral failings. But given the European soup of monarchy and class-tiered society that they emerged from, the experiment in democracy that they tried to launch was, and I'll defend this against all comers, it really was a moral triumph. But you don't go from a moral nightmare to perfection in one giant leap. You don't do it in a single generation, and apparently you don't do it in a century. Ensuring the freedom of speech, freedom of religion, of association, protections against unwarranted search and seizure, ex post facto laws, all that was huge. But by the time the world had fallen into the Second World War, it was evident that our 18th century Bill of Rights would never suffice to create the more perfect union that our founders envisioned. So in the midst of that global conflict, President Roosevelt envisioned coming out of that great war with the moral resolve to finish the job by creating a kind of economic independence that would actually make Americans free. Roosevelt proposed a second Bill of Rights with 8 points, and even though he proposed them more than 4 generations ago, really none of them have been entirely implemented. The last one about Social Security and Medicare certainly has been a huge gift, but we're still having to fight for all 8. The first of his points was the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. That is to say, no one who wants to work should be unemployed. The New Deal exemplified a primitive model of this by creating public works jobs, and the result of that was not just some of the bridges and parks that we still enjoy here in Springfield today, but also certain art was created at that time. It is possible to employ everyone. Everyone who is willing and able to work should be able to have a paying job. No exceptions, because exceptions to that actually generates poverty. His second suggested amendment said that all Americans have a right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. Roosevelt was obviously advocating for full employment at a living wage, but there is that one more word here that I don't want for us to miss, and that is recreation. That's why I asked Sean to add the song Bread and Roses. In the early women's union movement, they weren't just asking for enough pay to be able to have bread on their table, but shouldn't they also be able to have roses now and then? Anyone who works, human beings don't exist simply to work. There's more. It always worries me when I hear of GE or some plant giving someone a perfect attendance award for 40 years. In 40 years, you never came up with anything better to do than make refrigerators? You couldn't call in sick now and then? And we are not cattle to be milked for our labor and then turned into leather coats and shoes and hamburgers. Compensation for labor should be enough to provide for some quality of life, not mere existence, but also happiness, some leisure and recreation. 100 years ago, women marched for bread and roses because they wanted to be both free and happy. The failure to take note of Roosevelt's third and fourth amendments has resulted in a lethal transfer of wealth from the whole of the nation into the hands of the few. He mentioned the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give his family a decent living. The right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad. We were saying in class this morning, they still tell the story about the Boston Tea Party being about a tax on tea. That had nothing to do with it at all. It had everything to do with this giant British corporation that was bringing tea to the country that was cheaper than the tea that American business owners were able to sell in their tea shops. And so it was the businessmen that got everyone together to go out and throw the cheap tea into the harbor. Now, note how, David Adams, you're an American historian. You were supposed to say amen right then, weren't you? Okay, thanks. Note how, in the absence of sane guardrails on unbridled capitalism, the growth of Walmart made one family more wealthy than half of the nation, the lower half of the economy, that you have 150 million people that don't own as much as the 8 people who are in the Walton family. And family-owned businesses in every town and city across the United States went into bankruptcy, impoverishing even the people who worked at Walmart. That people that worked at Walmart at the lower income level also had to get food stamps, needed help with housing, and had to live in multi-generational homes. And now the upstart, as much as, I'm 62 years old, I've got 40 years of preaching under my belt, along with some other things. But we've hated Walmart for years, asking people not to shop there and to boycott Walmart. And while we weren't paying attention, Amazon.com comes up and has made Jeff Bezos the richest person in the world, putting many Walmarts out of business and putting other businesses, including most shopping malls in America, on really, really shaky economic legs. Now, thankfully, with the persuasion of both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, Jeff Bezos has just decided to raise the wages of his workers in America to $15 an hour. Now, that's a step in the right direction, but it still leaves our marketplace open to a handful of people becoming lords and making the entire rest of the nation a nation of serfs who can never own a business or hope to do more than minimally survive. Even if we get a base wage of $15 an hour for everyone, then you're still chained to the coffee plantation, because anywhere else you go, you would still just get $15 an hour. If we are really a free nation, then can we continue to allow the 1% to claim 80% of the earth and all of its resources for themselves and force the 99% to fight over the scraps? This unbounded economic system that can't seem to come up with a livable floor of income surely has to invent some kind of sane ceiling that makes the distribution of the world's wealth much more fair than anything we're ever going to get by just waiting for the largesse of the Walton or Bezos families, or even the relatively generous Gates and Warren Buffett families. Somewhere between the very rich or even the obscenely rich and master of the universe, there has to be a sane place where we can say enough is enough already. Amen. There are more than enough resources in the world to satisfy the needs of the poor. But folks, there will never be enough to satisfy the greed of the rich. The society as a whole has a right, nay, has an obligation to set sane boundaries to capitalism. I'm not opposed to capitalism. It just has to be a form of capitalism that has guardrails that works for the whole civilization and not just the top 1%. Now, Roosevelt's fifth tenet is the right of every family to a decent home. Now, our little church building was first constructed here in the middle of a lower middle-class neighborhood with very modest homes all around us. But in the past decade that we've owned this building, the area just outside of town has become populated with gated communities protecting private homes that look to me to be the size of small hotels and have evidently nearly as many rooms and bathrooms as a small hotel. And most of them, when I talk to people that know who live in these neighborhoods, there's not more than 2 people living in each one of those houses. I'm not sure what they're compensating for if 2 people need a 3-story home with 8 bedrooms and 8 bathrooms. On the one hand, you might say that such competition in a social edifice complex is none of our business. But is it none of our business when there are nearly 1,000 people in this city living under bridges and in drainage culverts and sewer catch basins? Can a just society let Fred and Susie sleep with their little Sarah and Billy in a car on Commercial Street, while Brett and Brittany have an 8,000 square foot home in Springfield and a 3,000 square foot cabin on the lake and a 4-bedroom ski lodge in Aspen. At some point, you have to see there's a connection between Brett and Brittany having too many houses and Fred and Susie not having a house. This is not complicated. Excess at one end of the scale creates deficits at the other end of the scale. The very wealthy will always have nicer digs than the poor. As Paul said, I've been rich and I've been poor. What Paul didn't say is rich is better. The rich will always have a nicer place to live. But can't we also say that there has to be a rational floor beneath which no one should fall? Shouldn't everyone have a safe and decent shelter in which they can cook and sleep and bathe? I wouldn't care if Brett had an elevator for his cars in his garage if I didn't see Fred being turned away at cross lines because did you know we can't give groceries to someone that doesn't have a refrigerator and a stove? Did you know that? You can be so poor that even a poverty program is not allowed to help you. Did you know that there are people with such little income that even Habitat for Humanity cannot give them a house? I'm just making the modest proposal that Brett can have his 18-seat home theater when Fred gets a refrigerator and a flushing toilet. That's not too much to ask. And I want to take this next amendment out of order because I think I queued it up right. I see it as being connected, yes, to the others just mentioned, the right to a good education. Long ago, our nation realized that we could not survive as a viable democracy without an educated population. But technology, the marketplace, and the global network of the economy has changed in such a way that a college education is as necessary to a successful career today as a high school education was a generation ago. What nations from Europe to South America have realized that if they want to be an economically successful country in the future, that they have to make university education tuition free, and they're doing it right now. Germany realized this. Go ahead. Enjoy yourselves. Germany realized this, so did Denmark, Finland, Venezuela. People, Slovenia doesn't charge tuition at their universities. But in the United States, we're doing the exact opposite. We're doing what our closest rivals and worst enemies would want us to do. If the Soviet Union could ask us to do anything to guarantee that their star will rise and ours will fall, if China wants us to do anything, it's to make tuition higher and make it more difficult for a larger group of people in the United States to receive a higher education, because that will make sure that if we don't correct this, we will become the nation that is exporting labor to go shine the shoes of the French and pick coffee beans in Venezuela. That wall between the United States and Mexico may become Mexico's best defense against American illegal agricultural workers pouring over their border, which is the only circumstance under which Mexico will pay for the wall. That was clever. That was more of a laugh line than an applause line. Help me edit this, will you? Our apparently crazy socialist political friend, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, also said that we should also have the right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. For all of Sarah Palin's warnings about death panels and Ben Carson's insistence that Obamacare is worse than slavery, our American healthcare delivery system that discriminates between the rich and the poor, between the insured and the uninsured, to a degree that Franklin Roosevelt, even confined to his wheelchair when he wrote this, he could have never imagined how screwed up our healthcare delivery system could become. I'm 62 years old, and I have never taken a sick day in my entire adult life, and yet my health care premium is more than my house payment. so that once a year, a very pretty young doctor with a diamond stud in her nostril can look at me and say, you know, you really ought to lose weight. I'm paying $14,000 a year for that advice. Millions of Americans die prematurely because they either have no insurance or they cannot begin to afford the high deductibles on the insurance they do have. Our system of rationing health care only to the wealthy and the well-insured actually costs more than giving adequate health care to everyone. And in light of that simple fact, Americans cannot escape being labeled as being moral monsters in the modern world. We could give health care to everyone and save money by doing it. We just don't want to. And the choice not to do so sends hundreds of thousands to their graves prematurely. And our politicians, with rare exception, never mention this fact. And you know what hurts me even more? Pulpits are silent on this fact. I don't have repeatable words strong enough to describe the contempt that I have for pastors that never talk about this topic. Amen. We've been trying to correct this situation for over a century. Every other industrialized nation in the world has done it. Countries whose church attendance is not a tenth of what it is in America. So when you hear me say that mainstream religion is more of a problem than it is a solution, I want you to understand I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths every year because our churches have not led our country in a revolution of conscience that would make us move to universal health care. Finally, Roosevelt's second Bill of Rights asserts that we all have the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. Now, this is the one of Roosevelt's 8 declared rights that he actually meaningfully addressed through the Social Security and Medicare systems. It's far from perfect, but it has been adulterated in a way to ensure that it will eventually collapse actuarially. Even still, such mathematical geniuses as George W. Bush and Marco Rubio have wanted to privatize it so that the hard-earned retirement money paid into by working people everywhere can then be stolen in fees for hedge fund managers. The very elite have an inexplicable and indefensible belief that they somehow are the rightful owners of the assets of the poor and the middle class. And the only thing that will keep them from taking those assets is if churches and labor unions and low-wage workers and voters will wake up and have a conscience, will wake up and defend themselves from being exploited by the powerful. Thank you. As you may have noticed, I have a real fondness for finding historical examples of people who promoted progressive ideas from long ago. Using Roosevelt's proposed Second Bill of Rights was actually a suggestion from one of our YouTube listeners. But I wrote this sermon sitting at the Gethsemane Monastery in the refectory, and Brother Luke sent his greetings to you. I noticed sitting right next to my coffee cup there in the refectory was a quote from the 4th century Turkish saint, St. John Chrysostom, who said, "Not to enable the poor to share in our goods is to steal from them and deprive them of life." Whether it was Roosevelt in the last century, St. Chrysostom in the 4th century, Jesus in the 1st century, or Buddha in the 4th century BCE, there has always been a clear and simple path towards a sincere spirituality and a healthy civilization, and that is to make sure that none of our brothers and sisters fall through the cracks of an economic system that always seems poised to steal their humanity from them, if not their very lives. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. You know that we have not become that more perfect union that still lies within our grasp, and it is your life assignment to bring it into existence.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.